Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to FACCC Budget Update webinar, the second webinar in our series. I'm Debbie Klein, the president of the Faculty Association of California Community Colleges, and I'll be our MC for the next hour. We're super happy that you could join us in the middle of summer. Thank you so much. And we realize these are challenging and unprecedented times of uncertainty due to the confluence of a global pandemic and an economic recession. We hope you're all staying healthy and safe. And now I would ask for the next slide, please. For those of you who are still new to FACCC, we thought we would share with you our mission, and that is to inform, educate, empower, and advocate for faculty in service to students and the communities of California. Next slide, please. We've got a fully packed hour for you all today. We will start with an overview of the 2021 budget. We'll answer questions from the Q&A. We'll have a conversation with two awesome local faculty union presidents, Dr. Jeffrey Michaels and Dean Murakami, and we'll have a final Q&A session. A couple ground rules. Please write your questions in the Q&A box. We will answer your questions as we go, and some of the questions we'll get to live. And we will have a hard stop at 4 p.m. And we're recording this webinar so you can check it out later and send it to your colleagues and networks. Next slide, please. And I would like to turn over the floor to our very own Executive Director, Evan Hawkins.
Thank you, Debbie. Appreciate it. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for joining. My name is Evan Hawkins. I'm the Executive Director for FACCC. I'll be leading us in a brief presentation covering some of the highlights and doing a general overview of the budget proposal that was signed by the governor this week. So some highlights that I wanted to start out with include in a change from what we saw in the May revise. The final budget proposal that was signed provides no cuts for apportionment or categoricals. So this is a sigh of relief to not have the devastating cuts that we saw in the May revise, and to see them not being reflected in the budget is certainly a positive development. However, the reason why there are no cuts is because the legislature and governor decided to use deferrals instead. And I'll talk about deferrals a little bit later. Another update from the budget that I wanted to highlight is that the hold harmless provision for the funding formula was extended an additional 2 years. And this is a critical aspect of the funding formula that a number of districts have relied on due to a number of reasons, but often the funding formula's inability to provide funding to fully fund our community colleges, and why FACCC has continued to work on the funding formula to work on removing performance-based funding and making changes that would be more advantageous for our colleges and our students. At the time, being a hold harmless is a good compromise that we are happy to be able to have in the final budget proposal for an additional 2 years. On the downside, there unfortunately will not be a cost of living increase or enrollment growth funding provided in this budget. Certainly we were hoping to see that. Certainly in January we were expecting that, but considering the economic realities we're in now, it was unfortunately likely that neither of these things would materialize. A couple other items just to mention is that there will be a food pantry expense created within the Student Equity Achievement Program. We saw food pantries as being an item the governor prioritized in January, but ended up removing the funding for. But now that funding can be used within the Student Equity and Achievement Program. And then finally, the Prop 98 split is maintained. Essentially what that means is community colleges will remain to get their 10.93% of Prop 98. This is critically important for the funding of our overall system, so something I wanted to highlight. Next slide, please. So the deferrals are a key part of this entire budget. It's what pulls it all together and makes it so there are not cuts. So within the previous year, so today being July 1st, we are now officially in a new fiscal year. From May to June, the months that we just passed, the deferrals are being paid in this current fiscal year now. So this is essentially just for accounting. In fact, the districts have already been paid the $332 million, but for accounting purposes, those are being paid in the current fiscal year we're in now, which is the 2020-2021. However, for the upcoming years, for 2020-2021 to 2021-2022, we're seeing significant deferrals. So $6.6 $662.1 million will be deferred from the current fiscal year we're in to the next fiscal year of 2020, 2021, 2022. So excuse me, 2021, 2022. So that is a significant amount of money, but on top of that, we're seeing $791.1 million will also be deferred that additional year. However, this is connected to federal funding. So if the federal government provides additional funding for the state, then this deferral amount will end up not being a deferral. It will be an actual funding instead. So it'll be money that districts actually get. However, this is contingent on the federal government providing funding. And again, at this moment in time, it remains unclear whether or not that will occur. We've seen some positive signs on that front and some not so positive signs. So it remains to be seen. And certainly we're going to be continuing to engage with our members of Congress to do everything we can to get that funding to come to California and support our colleges and our students. Next slide, please. So a couple other highlights I want to mention. Calbright's funding was reduced by $5 million in its ongoing funding. So rather than receiving $20 million, it's going to receive $15 million in its ongoing operating budget. And $40 million from the one-time money it received previously has been reallocated elsewhere. So that is certainly a significant cut to Calbright. And as many of you know, FAC and the other faculty groups have been steadfast in our opposition to this redundant and unnecessary college. We certainly wanted to see Calbright eliminated entirely. The legislature agreed with that approach. But at the end of the day, Governor Newsom appeared to make this a priority and decided to leave Calbright in there with these cuts. I can tell you that FAC will continue to work on again, advocating to reallocate funding from Calbright to our existing colleges, which, as we know, are now serving all of our students remotely and are, again, serving the bulk of our students in our community colleges, and therefore a better place for this funding to go. So we will continue to do that work. Next slide, please. Another highlight to mention is there is a block grant of $120 million in one-time Prop 98 and federal funding to support expenses such as the ones that are listed there. So this is directly funding to support our community colleges to be able to do work that supports their students, but directly related to COVID. So we're seeing some opportunity here for funding for the next few fiscal years that can be used to support our students, but also support faculty. In fact, this money can be used for professional development for faculty when it comes to the development of online courses. So this money will be distributed by the Chancellor's Office. They will be sending out communications on that soon. But what I know so far is that it'll be sent out based on FTES. So that's something I can share with you now, but the Chancellor's Office will provide more information in the coming days. Next slide, please. Another piece of this that's important. So strong workforce, which in the May revise was going to take a significant cut, is not seeing a cut, right? None of the categoricals are. Strong workforce, student equity and achievement, EOPS, all of them are being held at current levels. When it comes to strong workforce, however, the legislature in the budget language included some specific language about encouraging short-term workforce training programs. Now, this is only legislative language to encourage colleges to do these programs. There's no mandate. There's also no funding attached to it. But it's something I wanted to share because this is directly in response to COVID-19 and how districts can provide certificate programs to be able to potentially meet demand within their communities. Now, these would be 4 to 12-week programs, at least that's what the legislature has said in its language, and it is supposed to be directly connected to an employer within the community. So again, no mandates or anything here, but something to note and be aware of as you sort of engage in the strong workforce work locally. Next slide, please. So here's another item that you all should be aware of. So any COVID-19 related expenditures that occur in your district for the next year will be excluded from 50% law calculations. The legislature and governor believe this would provide flexibility to be able to meet the increased costs that districts may have associated with COVID-19. From FACC's perspective, we certainly appreciate and understand that there will be more expenditures as a result of the virus, but this isn't something that we wanted to see go on forever. And certainly faculty have been working overtime on their side, so certainly on the other side of the 50% law as well, we wanted to make sure that this was fair. So this will be a one-year sunset. The districts will be able to do this, and on July 1st, 2021, the sunset will expire. Next slide, please. So when it comes to pensions, there's something, one thing of note that I wanted to share. In last year's Budget Act, the legislature used a significant amount of money to help pay down and make supplemental payments to CalSTRS. Instead of doing that, because of the new environment we're in, they shifted that money and they're going to use it to help decrease the percentage that districts have to pay in their contribution when it comes to CalSTRS. So as you can see, the numbers are reflected on the slide here. So for the year that we just entered, districts will be paying 2.95% less, and in the subsequent year, 2.18% less. So I wanted to make sure to share that as your districts will be seeing some CalSTRS relief in the next 2 years. Next slide, please. So from where do we go from here? So as I mentioned for those of you that attended our previous webinar, the tax deadline being extended to July 15th has had impacts on the state budget. Some of the revenues are still unknown exactly and will be determined once that deadline passes. So we expect by the end of this month or beginning of August, the Department of Finance will have a better idea of what the revenues are looking like. And then perhaps we're going to have to go into another budget session here to tweak, revise the budget to reflect those updated revenues. I think that's likely. It's not necessarily guaranteed, but it's a possibility. And of course, that is concerning because it creates some uncertainty to the budget process and means that we could potentially see mid-year adjustments that are always going to be challenging, but it's something that you all should be aware of. And we will be following and working on closely. So continue to stay involved and engaged with FACC, and we'll keep you updated on that. Another important date to be aware of is October 15th. So that's when the federal funding has to come to California. And if it does not, the triggers I mentioned earlier, particularly the ones that have to do with the deferrals, will go into effect. So that $700+ million deferral will absolutely be a deferral at that point. The federal money comes in, then it's a different story. And then perhaps there's less deferrals to have to worry about. So again, this is a key part of what will happen during the summer months, is to advocate to our members of Congress to provide federal support and federal funding for our state and our colleges. Next slide, please. So a few remaining questions as I finish up here. So how will districts react to deferrals? We're going to have some union leaders here that are going to help answer this question from their local perspectives. But this is a significant amount of money. It's nearly $1.5 billion in deferrals across the system. It's a lot of money. Do districts have, or does your individual district have enough, have the reserves, the ability to borrow, those sort of things to be able to quote unquote float until the deferral funding comes in? Certainly the legislature and governor have been clear about this. They don't want to see any cuts to courses. They don't want to see students turned away. I think we learned our lesson from 10 years ago when we turned away nearly 600,000 students. That is the last thing that our legislative leaders and our governor want to do. So I encourage you all to not allow your districts to make cuts the first option. The budget was created this way to not make that be the case, right? The reserves are there for a reason, and that should be tapped into first, and then borrowing as well. From our perspective, and that has been our messaging throughout this entire process in our advocacy, is we don't want to be turning students away. But of course, what will the economy look like in the fall? If we continue to see higher deficits than we projected, we're going to have some challenges, and the budget may end up having to be reflected again in a very negative way. So something to keep our eye on. As I mentioned earlier, how much, if any, federal funding will come in, and as a result of all of these things, right, will there be any mid-year cuts? So these are all things to keep track of. We as an organization will be continuing to do the work and keeping you engaged on this, keeping you updated. But today, this is a snapshot in time to give you a budget highlight and give you an overview from the state perspective. But going into the next slide here, we will have Dr. Debbie Klein moderate a conversation with some local union leaders to talk about how they are handling the state budget locally.
Thanks, Evan. We're really lucky to have here with us today Dr. Jeffrey Michaels, the Executive Director of the United Faculty of the Contra Costa Community College District, and Dean Murakami, the President of the Los Rios Federation of Teachers. Next slide, please. And the first question for both of you is, how have your districts reacted to the state budget deficit? And we'll start off with Jeff and then move to Dean.
Okay, well, thanks. And thank you for having me and for the very clear presentation, Evan. I'll answer for my own district, but also just recognize the variety both within the Bay Area districts that I'm aware of and the CCCI districts that I'm aware of, because I do think a lot has to do with the level of transparency and reserves, I guess. Our district was, I think, very slow and prudent in responding to the budget and in waiting for real numbers to be in, which delayed us past, that time period where we often are dealing with budgets. Obviously, the budget news is coming in late and not all the news is in now. And I think there's still a lot of reticence to kind of declare us over the hump. Obviously, not having apportionment cuts and the strong workforce cuts, categorical cuts, is a huge relief, where we were looking at all kinds of possible reactions, from shrinking schedules and reducing student services to potential, other kinds of concessions of the sort that we make at the bargaining table. We've largely avoided all of that. We are, in my local district in Contra Costa, in the second year of a 3-year agreement where there was actually a modest salary increase that goes into effect July 1st, or that has gone into effect. And up until a week before, we still weren't sure whether that was going to be on schedule or not, even though we had, gotten close enough that it seemed like even if we wanted to change it, there really wasn't time. But we did get to a formal moment where the district asked us if we would be willing to delay implementation of our agreement, and we politely declined, and then went on to talk about how we will have to adjust in the long run. We do have the reserves locally in Contra Costa so that the deferrals largely are a loss of interest income. And so we've lost the COLA, we've lost some interest income. There are also some local revenue sources. A big one in my district is parking fees, which pays for a lot of our police services. Parking fees, bookstore, cafeteria. There are some places where the revenue generated pays for classified professional positions. So it's not as though the financial crisis is over and we're all celebrating. We did lose some revenue that we had budgeted for. There are some bright spots in the budget beside the extension of the hold harmless. One is the STRS deferral, essentially, which will help mitigate for my district some of the loss from COLA. We also had some savings in benefits locally, so that in the end, our CFO was able to present a balanced budget to the governing board, even with our negotiated salary increase on the books. So we did not wind up having to delay. We are concerned locally about shrinking schedules. We are not, and I know this is a question that's coming up later, but so far we are not facing in expanded demand. We are significantly down compared to this time last year in enrollment. And whether students are simply enrolling late or not, I don't know. But there is a lot of concern about how the district is responding to not just the budget crisis, but the likelihood that the budget crisis will continue, especially while we're in the hold harmless, where, as you know, serving more students does not generate more revenue for those districts that are essentially losers in the funding formula, which means we're the hold harmless districts, so that meeting our FTES targets does not affect the level of funding this year. So the pressure to reduce the number of sections, which reduces expenses on instruction, is significant. We don't lose the funding because we serve fewer students. So how student demand comes in and how we're able to protect sections that seem under-enrolled maybe at this point, where again, it's likely, I think, that students are going to be enrolling a little bit later, having to navigate the online system and decide that I really am going to take some classes online next semester. So For some districts, I think having to borrow for the deferrals creates an additional cost. And there certainly is a lot of book juggling, I would say, in terms of advice and how one deals with these things at the bargaining table. It's important for labor to recognize that deferrals are an accounting trick. They have some real repercussions in terms of either interest that you would be earning if you had the money, but banks and credit unions, we're not paying very much interest. We're not earning very much interest these days. And there may be some interest that has to be paid if a district has to borrow. Sometimes they borrow from the county, but those interest rates are very low as well. So I don't think unions, collective bargaining groups negotiating for faculty should be looking at the deferrals in any way the way we would look at cuts. For us, how the accounting gets done, while significant, should not be an impediment, should not be leading us to concessions at the bargaining table or significant reductions in schedule. But that really does depend on the level of transparency and dialogue locally, and on kind of standing up to what is still a very pessimistic, and I think appropriately, pessimistic attitude towards the budget, but recognizing that we sort of dodged a bullet this year. I don't know how long you want me to, I could talk until you tell me to stop, Debbie.
I think that was perfect. I'm going to turn it over to Dean. Thanks.
Dean fell asleep during my presentation. I understand, it often happens. Dean, are you on mute?
Sorry, I had to unmute here. Thank you, Debbie, very much for allowing me to talk a little bit about the Los Rios perspective. Since the pandemic hit and we understood that there was going to be a big financial revenue problem in the state, we've been meeting with our district at least twice a week concerning the not only budget but COVID and even our racial justice issues that are out there. We've been meeting constantly, and but in terms of budget, our vice chancellor of finance, Mario Rodriguez, he was formerly formerly worked for the Department of Finance and Higher Ed, and he was also the vice chancellor of finance at the state chancellor's office. So he understands and knows a lot of the intricacies of what's going on. He has a lot of contacts in different places. I have my contacts that I use, and we confer a lot on the budget and anticipating what's going to happen. And so as soon as we saw that the budget was not going to be looking good, the first thing we did is that we had 41 full-time hiring committees going on in the district in the spring, and we suspended all of those. Those were all eliminated to save money. The other thing we did was we conferred with the district, and if we did have to have cuts, which may still happen, and all the rest, it's a lot easier to cut now and add classes later than to have full classes and realize you can't afford all of those classes and cut classes that are either ongoing or put all those cuts onto the spring semester. That we felt was unsustainable. So we decided to do a 10% cut of classes right now, and that's what we did. We also instituted our college workload committees to make sure there's transparency and to understand which areas, which departments would be cut and why. And so we instituted that. We also focused on our preference, our seniority system for our part-timers, because we knew that these cuts in classes were going to hit our part-timers pretty hard. And so we wanted to make sure that our most senior part-timers were protected. We also have a limit on overload classes. We wanted to make sure that there was no abuse of the overload system that we have. And the other thing that was also important is that because some part-timers would be losing a class or whatever, a number of part-timers may fall below the threshold for qualifying for their medical care. And because if you're teaching 2 classes and you lose a class, you fall below the threshold to qualify for our district's healthcare. So if you're enrolled in our healthcare, we just put together an MOU just this last week, in which if you are in the healthcare system as a part-timer and you drop below the threshold, you will still maintain your healthcare for this fall semester. So part-timers are not going to lose their healthcare in the fall semester because we have cut classes. And we'll be meeting and we'll see what the situation is for the spring semester, and we'll be negotiating that as well. But we're trying to do everything we can to protect part-timers. We know, again, in August, there's going to be another look, and if it looks like there's going to be additional cuts that are going to happen, and they'll probably be on categoricals at first and then others. And those things are going to be, we'll meet again on those issues. But we've tried to be as prudent as we can to meet the challenges that are here. You know, if you take a look, in our last recession, which, you know, it was just so vivid in my mind because I was right in the middle of all of that at the state level and in the district. The overall level of deferrals was $960 million. $960 million. And that occurred over about a 3 to 4 year period. It built up to that. It wasn't automatic. Here we're looking at $1.4+ billion all in 1 year. It lets you understand the magnitude of the deferrals we're talking about immediately. And there's no way our district has enough reserves to cover that much money. It's a lot of money. Over that 5-month period is where the deferrals are going to occur over 5 months and be paid back in the next fiscal year. And of course, that puts another strain on the next fiscal year because you're going to be maybe $1.4 billion in the hole already for the next fiscal year. And the economy's not going to recover to compensate for all of that. So you're going to have additional deferrals probably the following year after that. So this is a budget drain that is spinning out of control if we're not careful about this. And as the economy does recover in the next 2 or 3 years, maybe, all the money, all the additional funds as we recover will go toward the deferrals and not to additional programs or to salaries and benefits for faculty. It's going to go to pay off the deferrals. And if we're a $1.4 billion, $2 billion in the hole, it's going to be difficult for districts to come back in that time, because we're going to be this flat level, flat salaries, barely being able to sustain ourselves. This is going to be a long problem that we have to think about, and which we've been discussing within our district a lot. So that's where we are, and we're continuing to talk with our district to try and make fine adjustments. And then as we go along, as changes occur, we will continue to meet to make sure that our district is fiscally sound and secure. And that's the bottom line for all of us. We want a secure, fiscally sound district, because if our district becomes bankrupt, we all lose. That's the bottom line.
Thank you, Dean. Super helpful. And I will ask for the next slide and let folks know that we've got 3 more questions for our guests, and then we're thinking about 15 minutes for all 3 questions. So that's just a note for Jeff and Dean, and I'll go ahead and ask the second question. So now that the state budget was approved without cuts, have your districts changed their approach to the local budget? And both of you touched on this a bit, but maybe if you could summarize for us, that would be helpful. So Jeff, it's to you.
Yeah, I would echo a couple of the things that Dean said. We also are meeting quite frequently with management, and we've signed a bunch of side letters covering everything from giving flex credit for some of the work that we've done, making the transition, to modifying people's sabbaticals. And obviously safety is a big issue going into the fall and trying to figure that out. We did not freeze hiring, although we did wind up delaying or deferring some faculty hires. But I would say that the biggest change to the approach to the budget has been to take a more long view. Again, Dean's description is accurate. I think we are looking at several years that will be difficult. And that being the case, making long-term plans for how we can economize and doing the kinds of enrollment management and having those kinds of discussions locally, really going to be important over the next several years. We have been trying not to sort of preemptively shoot ourselves in the foot, however, by significantly reducing schedules. And again, the very same thing of trying to keep part-timers in district benefits, really looking at how to make sure that people's jobs are protected, even while we are, shrinking. There's some economy in the moment as well, right? Of all the things that we're not earning money on, we also have places where we're saving money. We're not, for example, making lots of photocopies at the moment, and having our physical plants shut down has some energy savings and other kinds of savings. So we're taking a close look at the budget and moving slowly. And again, we had a lot of sort of preemptive reductions in mind that have now been deferred to some extent. I do think we're still seeing some scheduling reductions, maybe some reductions of counseling services, depending on whether we have some in person or not. But I think there's so much in transition at the moment that we've just been trying to amp up the collaborative dialogue and the long-term planning, and avoid sort of blanket discussions about how the roof is falling in and so we need to freeze all spending. We're trying not to do that. And we're trying to make sure that both our students and our faculty have the technology that they need, so that we're eliminating digital divides and shifting some of the money. And the last thing I'll just draw attention to is there's quite a bit of one-time money for transition between the CARES dollars and the money in the budget that Evan pointed to. Some of that can obviously go to faculty for the work that we're all doing, taking our classes online, but it also creates a pool of money that can purchase equipment. I know our district has negotiated with the cable company so that we're able to give free high-speed internet access for 6 months or a year to students. So we've gotten some grants and some help from the providers as well. And I think that's going to be a focus next year too, making sure that students have internet access and the technology, and that faculty, particularly part-time faculty, have what they need. Do they need a big screen? Do they need a whiteboard? Do they need a document camera? What are the tools that will allow us to teach well?
Thank you, Jeff. Dean, it's to you now.
Thank you. Well, I think that our approach has not changed. We're meeting. We want to make prudent cuts. We want to make them gradually so that there's not some sudden gigantic shift in our finances, and we're trying to protect our finances the best that we can. So it's a collaborative approach that we're really taking here with our constant meeting, and of course having that insight from our Vice Chancellor that has the experience with the State Chancellor's Office and the Department of Finance, and getting input from what's going on behind the scenes there is extremely important. And so we do know that if there are additional cuts that are going to be made, then we will meet and we will make those adjustments. That's what we have to do. And but just to understand the issue here, if we don't get any COLA or growth, as an example, just to maintain our salary schedule, that increases by about 2% every year in Los Rios. As people go up the salary schedule and increase their steps and everything else, I have to find 2% more money just to maintain the salary schedule. So if I get no COLA, I have to find that money somewhere. So if I say, well, if I have to cut some classes so that people can maintain the salary schedule and get their step increases and everything else, I have to do that. Okay, those are the balances that we have to make. There are costs that are going to happen that we have to account for within our budget, and that's the reason why we have to prudently look at these things. And we're again, strategically, how do we make cuts in terms of number of classes but maintain enrollment? And that's the whole thing. One of the things that we were looking at is, since we're all online basically, we were taking a look at our summer enrollment numbers just to get an idea of what might happen in the fall. And right now, our summer enrollment pattern of all online is actually up from the previous year by about 10%, 10-15%. So it is, we were afraid that we might lose a tremendous amount of enrollment in the fall. And so far, based upon our summer enrollment, it doesn't look like that might happen. My concern, and of course, even if we do have a little bit of a fall off, we can borrow off that increase in summer that we had to help to try and make up for that. But my concern is that, and we see this very clearly, is that as the University of California and Cal State Sacramento go to all 100% online as well, many of their students are coming to our colleges because they can pay a lot less for the same class. And so we think that that's what's happening, is that a lot of these schools from CSU, a lot of students from CSU and UC are coming to take our classes, and that's what's filling up our enrollment. Our concern, and my concern, is that I know what's happened in this last semester in the spring, that many of my students that are most vulnerable disappeared when we moved to online. And that, we have to, as we're forced to go online in this environment, are we going to continue to lose those students who are our most vulnerable students, those that are in poverty, those are students of color and all the rest? Are they going to continue to fall behind because of us moving to online and they don't have the technology to keep up? And those are the issues that I see that are really critical, because it could change the face of the demographics of our students.
Thanks so much, Dean. And we're going to go ahead and move right along to the next question. Is your district seeing increased student demand? If so, how will it meet that demand with existing resources? Again, you both pretty much touched on this, but I'll send it over to you for quick answers. Jeff.
Good. Sorry, I was switching to the screen with enrollment data. Based on the most recent data from this week, comparing fall enrollments in my district as of today to fall enrollments in my district as of a year ago, with almost the identical number of courses being offered, we are down about 10%. My smallest college, Contra Costa, is down almost 20%. Whereas the biggest college, DVC, is almost even. So it is balancing out in the district to about 10% less enrollment. Nonetheless, I think we are still planning under the assumption that we will have more enrollment, not less. I again, agree with Dean that it seems likely that many students, when they learn that their four-year institutions will be fully online in the fall, will reconsider paying the big tuition. If I'm going to be online anyway, maybe I'll defer enrollment if I'm a freshman. Maybe I'll do something different. And if I'm going to be, again, learning from my own living room, might as well go to community college and save money. I think that is likely. And obviously the economy, whenever unemployment is up, we tend to see more people retraining and coming back to school. So all the indicators suggest that enrollment should be up. And I suspect that people are just a little bit slower. You can't just drive over to school and enroll or get in line now. You really have to kind of be organized and go online and try to figure the whole thing out. but very hard to predict. And of course, this is, I mean, we're facing two real problems, right? The biggest problem is the one that is depressing every single one of us these days, which is we don't know when this will end. If we could just know that it's only 6 more months, I can hang in there and I'll do the things I need to do. It's only another year, but we do not see the end. We just are hoping that one day they will announce that they've medically caught up to our virus. And so, but for planning a business, planning enrollment, not even knowing whether our classes can be fully in person or partially hybrid or very, very difficult, and even doubly difficult for our students. So I'm not surprised that students are not sure yet what they're going to do in the fall. But I suspect, since there's almost nothing else one can do sheltering in place, take some classes, I'll be very surprised if enrollment's not up. And somebody asked on the, Tracy, on the chat, what are we going to do? I mean, if enrollment exceeds capacity, since we're not being funded for growth, and since we are under some pressure to reduce the cost of instruction because we're losing COLA and because we're anticipating a couple of bad budget years, what are we going to do if demand exceeds supply? There was a suggestion in my district that we incentivize faculty overloading their classes by allocating extra dollars. And I know some districts actually already have some kinds of systems like that, where if one overloads a class, one can get paid extra. We don't have that in my district, and it's not an idea that we've sort of taken off with. It was just floated in bargaining and conversations, and we haven't gone there yet. But I do think we're going to be talking about, I mean, in the last recession, we did all overload our classes, but speaking for myself, it's a lot easier for me to overload a lecture class than it is an online version where I'm responding in writing individually to each student. And people are feeling stretched thin already, and we're not even into our first fall of mostly, if not all, online teaching. So I think it's a very difficult question, and the one that we're probably focused on the most. How are we going to adapt what we do to serve our students so that this doesn't inhibit, interrupt their ability to meet their educational goals in some kind of a timely way? I think that's why we all stepped up at the end of last spring, genuinely figuring out how to do this for our students. But we're going to need to become more methodical and with more advanced planning, obviously, to figure this out for next year.
Thanks, Jeff. And it's to you, Dean.
Okay, so again, I think that I don't think we'll see a large decrease in enrollment overall. I think where our demand is, and really truly, is in our lab classes that have to meet face-to-face, especially those in nursing and allied health and others. Those are frontline workers that we're trying to train, and they need their lab classes in order to graduate. And we need to get them out there in the community to combat the COVID virus and all the rest. So that's where a lot of demand is, that we want to make sure that these students get their lab classes done. And that's the reason why we will have a few lab classes being offered in the fall for some of these very, very high priority classrooms, lab classes. But we have to do it safely, and this is the reason why it's taking a lot of time for us to consider how this is going to be done so that it's safely done. We have a lot of students that want to take their, let's say, our CTE courses, whether it's automotive, whether it's in culinary arts, whether it's ceramics, welding, other programs that we have. How do we do that safely in these lab environments? Can we do it? And those are extremely difficult processes to put together and make sure that it's safe, make sure that we work with our classified units to make sure that they have the capacity to meet the demands of disinfecting and all the rest that has to happen. This is a very difficult coordinated effort, and of course, if it's not going to be done safely, we're not going to offer the courses. That's the bottom line. And so we will have maybe a limited number of lab classes that are going to be offered this coming fall. Our part of our issue and discussion is those faculty that traditionally do these lab classes, how do they make load so that we can pay them? Those have been in discussions for a long time with the district, and we're still trying to work this out.
Thanks so much, Dean and Jeff. We are going to go ahead and skip past the next question and open it up to be able to spend some time answering your questions. We have about 150 of us on the call and lots of questions to answer. So I'm going to turn it back over to Evan.
Thank you, Debbie. Appreciate it. And thank you, Dean and Jeff. And I have been answering some questions in the chat. Stephanie has as well. And I see Jeff answered a couple. I'm going to do my best to answer some of them live that I saw some patterns of. And I'll also ask if Dean and Jeff want to jump in. I know some of them were mentioned by Dean and Jeff after they were asked, so I'm not going to touch on those. But there were more questions about deferrals. And I know this was touched on by a few of the different speakers, and it was touched on in the chat. But when it comes to the deferrals, in the meantime, until the districts get the money, they really can rely on borrowing and reserves, right? And again, I think the key thing I want to share, and Jeff touched on this, is the deferrals shouldn't be considered as the same thing as cuts locally, right? When you're negotiating locally or even having conversations locally with your administrators, they aren't the same thing. They're deferrals. And in this particular environment with low interest rates, and again, the sort of the really crisis that we're in, public health crisis and economic crisis, I mean, these are the times that reserves are for, especially if those reserves will be reimbursed by the state. Now, it certainly is a fair point that the state certainly can push back the deferrals. They may not pay them exactly when they're saying they're going to pay them right now. And that's a fair point and something to understand. In fact, during the last recession, it took, I think, almost 4 years for all the deferrals to be paid. However, that was a different circumstance and sort of a slower slope to getting to where we're at this very moment. So nonetheless, that's worth mentioning, but districts do have the ability to pay the bills, as was the question in the chat, until the deferrals come in. When it comes to federal funding, I appreciate the skepticism that the federal government will do the right thing. I share that skepticism, so I'm right there with you, particularly with the political environment that we're in, and certainly with the leadership within Washington, D.C. But nonetheless, this is a challenge. COVID-19 has affected all the states, and particularly right now, it seems to be impacting some of the more Republican states. And I only share that because the Republicans are in leadership and obviously in the presidency and within the Senate. So I think that actually would increase the chance that states could see more support. As maybe as cynical as that is, there is that political dynamic to this. So perhaps that will increase the chances of there being federal support. We shall see. There was a question about specifically how counselors and librarians will be impacted by the state budget deficit. Again, there are no cuts within apportionment categoricals and nothing that should impact counselors and librarians. The funding is the same as current levels, but at the same time, there are local decisions to be made here, right? I mean, I'm sharing the perspective from the state budget, but locally districts have the ability to make cuts if they want to. Again, the legislature and governor have been clear that they don't want to see that impact, those cuts to occur, because of course they will impact students if you did decide to cut faculty, librarians, right, counselors. So again, I think it's incumbent upon faculty locally to be able to be empowered, be aware of what's occurring, and to be able to push back against cuts as they come up. And that's part of the reason why we had Dean and Jeff on this call, was to share with you how to do that. And certainly as an organization, we want to be there to be able to support and empower our folks locally, and we will continue to be so, to continue to do that, excuse me. So, that is a big part of this as well. The state aspect of this is now shifting locally. So there's still much work that needs to be done there. So partner with your unions and your faculty locally. But this will provide you with the information you need coming from the state legislature to be able to advocate stronger and be in a stronger position locally. So that is a big reason why we are doing this work. And I see Dean has his hand up.
Yeah, so I just want to make 2 points, just 2 quick points. Number one, when I take a look at the amount of deferrals in our district, it is way beyond the amount of money we have in reserves. Everybody should take a look at that because it is way beyond that. So we're going to have to borrow that money. And that's going to be a 2 to 3% probably cost in terms of the borrowing of the interest rate that we're going to have to pay. So that's all automatically a loss that's going to happen. And then these institutions that we used to use in the last go around, they got wise and started increasing the interest rate tremendously. It used to be like 1 to 2%, and all of a sudden became 3 and 4% because they knew that they had nobody had any choice. So we have to be careful about that. The other thing that I want to say that I think is extremely important is that our state legislature, if they're not willing to meet the $54 million deficit that or $54 billion deficit that we're under, okay, and not willing to make the cuts that are going to be necessary as well, and just sort of kick it down the road, they need to get a backbone and say, we need more revenues in the state in order to meet the deficit that we have. And so at CFT, California Federated Teachers, we're proposing a billionaire's tax. A billionaire's tax that would bring in about $18.5 billion in revenues to the state that would help to make up for the deficit that's occurring during this time. Because billionaires during this COVID pandemic period have made billions of dollars. Out of the 161 billionaires in California, their net worth has increased by $141 billion since March, just this past March. Okay. Zuckerberg, his net worth since March has increased by $32 billion. These people can afford to be taxed a little bit, 1%, 1.5%, to help make up temporarily this budget deficit that we have. So we need to push the legislature to consider tax increases of whatever kind to try and meet, even if it's just temporary, just to meet this deficit, COVID, pandemic, economic deficit that we're under right now, to get us through so that we don't have severe cuts that could happen in the future. That's what we need to do, and urge our legislators to do it. We have a 2/3 majority of Democrats in both houses. We just have to make sure to hold their feet to the fire and say, hey, we need this. We got to pass it. It's critical. At least put an initiative on the ballot to get revenues in.
Thanks, Dean.
Debbie, Evan, can I add one more thing?
Yeah, I wanted to turn it over to you, Jeff.
I just wanted to piggyback on another. All that is good, and where our advocacy should be. I just want to piggyback on what Evan was talking about. I'm particularly worried about part-time librarians. If the physical libraries are not opening, often our part-time librarians are sort of the first casualties of reductions, part-time counselors also. But with librarians, it's really important locally to remind management how much we faculty rely on the support of librarians, especially in online teaching, where a lot of times, whether it's helping your students with their information competency, or just helping you find a video or figure out how to caption it, or is there a way to get this particular thing that I want to use in my class? We don't want to see the level of library support degraded if we can help it, and we want to try to fight for those jobs. And that's one argument we've been using locally that has worked.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. And thank you both for those points. And I would add to Dean's remarks, before we got into this budget environment that we're in now in this budget deficit, community colleges were the lowest funded per student system of public education in our state, right? So we came into this crisis already with a revenue problem, as Dean mentioned, right? So this is a big component of it. In fact, in addition to what Dean mentioned, the Schools and Communities First Act, which will be on the ballot this November, something that FACCC supports, and I know CFT does it as well as CTA and all the other organizations, it's going to be a big part of this. So that's obviously an additional component, and certainly there's a political aspect of that FACC will be engaged in. So a couple other things as we have, let's see here, 3 minutes. Just want to count just one more item. There was a number of questions about student enrollment, and Jeff touched on this a little bit. And so far, we're still collecting data to see what student enrollment is going to look like. But of course, in past recessions, our community colleges have seen an increase in student enrollment. So we certainly understand that that's going to be challenging to meet that increase with existing funds, and especially if there is less than existing funds due to local circumstances and not being able to float and meet the deferrals. But nonetheless, I think from our perspective, the goal is to be able to, and again, it's the legislature's perspective here, so they need to be able to step up to be able to provide the funding to do this and the support to do this. But we really want to be able to serve all the students that we can within our system. We're certainly understanding that there are incredible funding challenges that make that incredibly difficult to do. But that's really the key, and that's what our system is there for. And during times of recession, our system is counted on even more. And so just to finish on that note, certainly we understand that a lot of these conversations will be local. We understand the dynamics locally are different. Again, some regions of the state may see increases in student enrollment, while others may not. But nonetheless, that is something that we are going to strive for. So if I could just get the final slide here to finish up. So the next steps here as we conclude, and again, I know we didn't get to all the questions in the chat, so I apologize for that. But there are some next steps here that you all can engage in. Please use the FACC action alerts on our website. Right now we have an action alert, so you can email and contact your legislators very easily, or excuse me, your members of Congress very easily to request the federal funding, which is, again, sort of what's right in front of us. But to Dean's point, there will be larger conversations about what we can do locally regarding the budget, increasing revenue, and other things that will happen and occur in the coming months. Be vigilant locally, or excuse me, I skipped one there. Share the recording of this webinar. Please share this with your colleagues, and certainly we want to make sure this information gets shared far and wide. Be vigilant locally. I've kind of honed in on this in some of my comments, but this is really important. And we are here to be able to help you be better advocates for faculty locally within your districts and your colleges. Attend future budget webinars. We're going to keep the conversation going. If there's any changes or any impacts or updates from the state budget, we will continue to have these conversations with you, continue to provide information on our website, and particularly the weekly and through social media. And invite us to have a virtual presentation at your campus. We've done a few of these. We've joined in on union meetings that are, of course, virtual, Senate meetings, to do an update and be able to answer some of those questions maybe more specifically and have more time to answer questions. So feel free to contact us to do so, and send any follow-up questions to info@facc.org. And again, if you want to invite us out to campus, also info@facc.org. That's the best place to contact us to get your question to the right person. But as we conclude here, it's 4 o'clock exactly, so I will stop and I will just say thank you all for being here and taking the time. Jeff, Dean, thank you so much. Debbie, thanks for leading the conversation. Debbie, do you have any final words to share for the group?
Thanks, Evan. You just about covered it all. I just wanted to, again, also thank our guests. Thank you, Evan, for putting this together, and stay healthy and safe out there.
And for the advocacy, really good work this year, FACC, advocating for our budget priorities. We did well, all things considered.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.